There is a yearning. Do you resonate with that? Heidi Newmark is a Lutheran pastor who ministers in one of the most challenging areas of the Bronx in New York. She loves Advent. And the reason for that is it's a reflection of how she feels. She says, Lent comes along, and I'm not really always feeling repentant. Easter comes along, and I'm not always feeling the power of the resurrection. I'm not always filled with the Spirit when Pentecost draws near. But Advent, I'm always yearning. I'm yearning for things to be different than what they are. I'm waiting for God to show up. I loved that and recognized in her words the way that I often feel. This is the first Sunday of Advent. It is the beginning of the liturgical year. So Happy New Year's, church people. And it's the time when we in the West describe is waiting for Christ to come. And for a little spice, there's thrown in, we're waiting for Christ to come again. Now, for some of us, that works, that language and those concepts. For some of us, it doesn't. And if it doesn't, then I'll invite you to consider the way the Eastern Orthodox Church considers it. A little bit more encompassing. Advent is the time where we're waiting for the incarnation of the divine. The time that we're waiting for God, for Spirit, for love to be made flesh and enter into creation. I think we look at our lives, we look at our world, and most of us, even the most optimistic, are in a place where we realize we need something other than what is. We look at the news. We look at our workplace. We look at oftentimes our own families that we've probably experienced a great deal of over the past weekend. And it just seems like we're all at odds. There are things happening in the world that are bigger than we can understand, much less do anything about. We realize that there needs to be something new to which is given birth. But the problem is, we're so stuffed wall to wall that it doesn't feel like there's any space for that to happen. A few years ago, our family started buying our Thanksgiving meal instead of making it. We decided we didn't want to spend our whole day off anymore cooking. So we buy it, and we used to buy it the day of, hot and prepared. Then we kind of felt guilty about making those folks work on Thanksgiving. So now we get it ahead of time, and this year we got it from Aioli's. It was wonderful. It was amazing, of course. But we picked it up on Wednesday. And so here we had these two great big bags full of, I think, just some of the most wonderful food that's produced in the area. We got it home to our house, but there was a problem. Our refrigerator was full. And so we had to go through, we had to pull out the leftovers from who knows when, which our better selves told us we would eat at some point. And old products and produce, we had to make room in order to put that wonderful new food in the refrigerator so that we could prepare it on Thanksgiving. And I think we see that in so many places in our lives. From the time we were knee-high and able to toddle into a Sunday school class, we've been told the story of Mary and Joseph who went to Bethlehem because of the census. And there was no place for them to stay. And yet they found this one inn where there was space that was able to be made. And into that space, the divine became a specific flesh. One of the greatest stories in the history of stories. And yet Meister Eckhart reminds us, what good is it if God was born to Mary all of those centuries ago, if God isn't born into me here and now, into our world here and now? And what might we be able to do to make space for that to happen? So it's been a pretty rough few weeks. Lots of challenges, lots of things to deal with, lots of work to do. And I felt myself getting wound up really tight over the past few weeks. And then we got to this week, and circumstances haven't changed that much. There's still a lot of work to do. There's still a lot of challenges to be faced. But I found myself yesterday and today in a much better place, and I was trying to figure out the reason that was. And I realized that one of the reasons is because I had a day off this week. Was able to take Friday off and spend that with my wife, and we came here and we hung decorations with many of you. Thank you all for being here and working on that together. And then we went to lunch together and just were together, and then came home and rested. Things are a lot easier when there's a little bit of space, when there's a little bit of margin in our lives. And over the next few weeks, we'll be looking at some practical ways in order to do that. But my question for us this morning is this: is there the space, is there the room in our lives for us to receive and invite the incarnation, the birth of Jesus? I learned something this week, speaking of the Eastern Orthodox Church. And so many of us are used to some type of fast during Lent. You know, we're used to giving something up for Lent, and we participate in that or not based on where we are at that time of year. But the Eastern Orthodox Church has a fast for Advent. It's called a Nativity Fast, and actually it's 40 days. It begins before Advent. But the purpose of that, very specifically for them, is to make space for the incarnation of the divine, to prepare hearts and prepare souls. The grace of God, the love of God, the compassion of God, the mercy of God is all around us all the time. There's nothing that we can do to earn that. And yet, it's been recognized throughout the history of spirituality and the Christian faith that there are things that we can do to better prepare ourselves to receive that. We talk often in our faith community about contemplative practices, about meditation and centering prayer, such a gift from the Catholic side of Christianity over the past few years. But interestingly enough, when Thomas Keating and others in Snowmass, Colorado were developing this idea of centering prayer, this practice of opening ourselves to God, over on the Protestant side during the same time in the 80s and 90s, there were others that were working on other spiritual disciplines. One of those is Richard Foster, a good Quaker, and Dallas Willard, who has passed, a good Baptist. But together they talked about celebrating and understanding the spirit of the disciplines. An unfortunate word, because discipline usually has a negative connotation in our life. Maybe practices would be a better word. But they talked about things that open ourselves to the presence and the movement of God in our lives. And so they talked about coming together in worship. They talked about the practice of solitude, of just sometimes being by ourselves. And then they also talked about the practice of fasting. And there's all different types of ways that we can fast, but fasting, just very generally and very basically, is giving something up for a period of time in order to make space for something else. So the Nativity Fast is pretty intense. It's no meat or poultry or fish or dairy or wine or oil for the period of 40 days. I don't know that we need to engage that to get a benefit from it. But I'll invite us to consider over this 4-week period, what is something that you might be able to release in order to create some space and some room for the movement of God? Maybe you're like me, and your life is so tight that there's little room for God to get in, even if God were to try. What space can we make? One of the things I've already decided I'm going to give up is social media for the period of Advent. So no more going on Facebook, which we've found out over the past several weeks, sole purpose is to keep us on Facebook so that folks can sell us stuff that we don't need to fill up our already stuffed homes. For me, anyway, that seems like a good place to start. Maybe it is giving up a certain food. Maybe, I read a great article this past week by Catherine Marshall, who is a missionary and wife of Peter Marshall, who talked about fasting from criticism. Can you imagine doing that for 4 weeks? Not criticizing anyone or anything. Maybe that would slow down the voice in our head to an extent that there might be room, that there might be space for something else. Maybe it's letting go and releasing some of the narratives that we've lived by. Maybe we could find someone that we trust to share that with, or maybe seeking a professional to speak to over the course of Advent. What are the stories that we continue to play that no longer serve us? The gospel passage for the first Sunday of Advent, which you notice we didn't read today, is from Luke. And it talks about the end of days, when the sun and moon go dark. The gospel passage on the first Sunday of Advent is always about judgment and the end of the world. I figured, we're facing that every day these days, so we don't really need to read about it. But maybe we can even step back and think about that. Maybe what needs to end is the paradigm that we live in, the water that we swim in, the story that we tell ourselves that keeps change from happening in the world. Stories like, if people have a different skin color than I do, then they're less intelligent or not as able or capable. Maybe it's the story that people are poor because they're lazy and they need to get off their bums and go do something. Maybe we can release those stories. Maybe that's the invitation of seeing the end that we're told in the Gospels and in the prophets. Jenny read to us from Jeremiah, and we've talked about Jeremiah a lot. It was written during just a horrible time in the life of the Hebrews. They had been captured and they'd been transported, if they weren't killed, to Babylon, where they lived in exile. And Jeremiah, for the most part, is this book of just gloom and doom. If you're in a bad place, I would not recommend reading it extensively at all. But then there's these places of hope that spring up. And this morning is an example of that. From the stump of Jesse, a sprout will form. New life, something different, a righteous branch. Oftentimes, in order for branches, new sprouts to grow, and those of you that are gardeners will know this, there needs to be some space made. There needs to be some pruning done, not always pleasant, in order for that new growth to come. I'm wondering, what space can we make in order to see new divine life in the midst of our lives and in the midst of the world? Maybe we can make some space and go back to our Sunday school days and ask ourselves, if it's more clear, if it's easier, what room am I making in the inn? And of course, the great privilege that we have is the ability to do that together in community. I've become enamored with the phrase of Suzanne Stabile. She's speaking specifically of the Enneagram, but I think it goes for the whole spiritual life. It's solitary work that we can't do alone. We can enter into relationship, hold each other accountable, encourage one another, lean on one another in the pain of letting go or in the pain of having our security taken from us. So I will invite you this week, if you do decide to enter some type of fast, just email me or call me and let me know. And I'll be praying for you, as hopefully you will be praying for me during this time. Let's pray together.